Talk Show. Recorded live.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation or around the world. Once again, you are listening to the VMware Communities Roundtable podcast. This is podcast number 582. My name is Eric Nelson, and with me today, I have my regular co-host, Matt Lungeth. Today's actually Tuesday, November 23rd, because this is Thanksgiving week, so we're doing it a day early. Matt, how you doing today?
Yes, Eric, special episode this week, a day early. It's Thanksgiving holiday here in the U.S. for all our U.S. listeners. And, I hear all these things about pricing increases for, consumables and food goods and product surges and whatnot as we come on to that Thanksgiving holiday. But sometimes I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because, Aunt Jean's green bean casserole that we were forced to choke down and smile and acknowledge might be a little delayed or set aside for a new dish this time of year. So we have to take advantage of these things in all things supply chain. So, not necessarily a bad thing as we come to the Christmas and Thanksgiving season. But of course, sir, how are you? How are things out on the West Coast? And most importantly, what is the color of the bay today?
We're doing well, and just as you say that, my wife's asked me yesterday, can we stop making that green bean casserole with the mushrooms and crunchy onion stuffs on top? And I'm like, no, you may not. You may not. I want my green bean casserole. But it is beautiful weather here. It's crisp and chilly. We're coming into the winter season. We've had our rain. It's dried up a bit, and it's crisp and chilly now, and the leaves are all changing. So if you're in the U.S. somewhere, you're probably experiencing the same thing. Winter is upon us, and so looking forward to that. On the show today, we're going to be talking about the truth about Kubernetes, the benefits and the challenges. We've got Michael Cote here, member of the technical staff in Pivotal. So we'll get to Mike in a second, but before we do that, Matt, any news on vExperts? I think that's the only thing we've got today with regard to what's happening in the world.
We do. Second half of 2021, vExpert applications will open up here very shortly, 12/6. So vexpert.vmware.com for the application itself. And if you have any questions about the particular application process, be sure to reach out to your local vExpert Pro, who will help you guide through submitting your necessary pre-qualifications as part of that application submittal.
Excellent. All right. And with that, we'll just get right into it. Let's introduce Michael. And Michael, tell us, we always start with, who are you? We're a community podcast. So who are you? What's your career arc? How did you get where you are today? How long have you worked at Pivotal or VMware? Just to get to know you a little bit before we get into the topic today.
Oh, okay. Well, as I always tell my daughter when she asks me what's wrong with me, I say, how long do you have? But I'll try to keep it brief.
All right, we give you on this show 5 minutes here, maybe 5 to 7 minutes.
That's
a little bit about yourself. Who are you? How did you get here?
That'll be plenty. Well, I'll go reverse chronological order. So yeah, I work at VMware in the Tanzu group, so
we're doing the Benjamin Button version of Michael today, right?
That's right. I'm gonna die as a baby, which I guess is sad, but something about the supply chain I think requires this.
That's what it's about. Exactly.
So I work in the Tanzu group, and I work on something called the developer advocate team, which is pretty self-descriptive, but I don't actually work with developers nor advocate for them really. What I more do is I talk with managers and executives and enterprise architects about just basically getting better at doing their software or digital transformation when it comes to custom written software. And so what we in Tanzu do, and at Pivotal, where I come from, with VMware acquired them at some point, essentially we have both products that we sell that help you run your software better, but a lot more of what I talk about and what people are challenged with is more of the methodology of doing agile software development and design-driven software, or cloud-native development, as some people call it nowadays, and getting at a point where you do software on basically weekly release cycles, and it's very user-driven, if you will, observing what people do with it. And so, we work mostly with larger organizations, just from government agencies to banks to stores back in the States, like Dick's Sporting Goods or Kroger and those kind of places, JPMC, the usual enterprise software people that you work with. And with them, we all work on essentially, they want to, as I was saying earlier, get better at doing their software. Like Home Depot's a well written up example back in the States of what we do. Here's a fun fact for you. I live in Europe. If you say hardware store, no one knows what you're talking about. You have to say DIY store. There's also a German hardware store called Hornbach, and it is exactly like Home Depot, but in no way associated. Like you go into it and it has burnt orange instead of bright orange. And they use that same fake felt tip marker thing. So, next time you're in Germany, go to a Hornbach. They have free bathrooms, easy to use, unlike the entirety of the rest of Europe. So, it'll be companies like that. And, it's essentially like, I bring that up because, for example, when you go to Home Depot, there's you go get custom paint. And there's actual software that they use at that desk just to run that. And so that's an example of something that we do there. So anyways, I started working at Pivotal in 2015 or so, basically in this role of studying what people would do with software and talking with customers and speaking at conferences. And I do a lot of podcasts and videos and write books and stuff like that. But before that, I was a research for just a little bit at this place called 451 Research. And then before that, I'm originally from Austin, Texas. I worked at Dell in corporate strategy and M&A, of all things, helping out with the software, creating a software group there, like acquiring Quest and some other things. And then Dell had a public cloud business for a little bit that I was in charge of the strategy for it before they didn't have it. And then before that, I worked at an analyst firm called RedMonk. I was the first person that they hired into there. You might have encountered their programming index that they do nowadays. They do all sorts of other stuff.
Right.
Yeah. So that was fun. I started working there in 2006. Yeah. And before that, I was a programmer for 10 years at, relevant. It's fun. At VMware, people actually know who BMC software is. So I worked at BMC for a long time on basically the rewrite of Patrol, which was called Performance Manager. And so I'd done a lot of stuff there. And then I worked at an online banking startup before that, back in the 90s. And before that, when e-commerce was new in 1996.
So wait, you're really going back to Babyland where you must be 8 years old now. So you're writing code at 8 years old, right?
That's right. I think, yeah, pretty much 8 years old, or more like 15 or 16. But that's that was my entry into programming. Is I like messing around with computers, and the CEO of this startup that we used VRML at some point to do in the late 90s, the immersive going into a mall, kind of shopping around is pretty awesome.
Yeah,
and I think what the CEO figured, high school kids were dirt cheap. Right? They could program and you could pay them next to nothing. And we tried to sell cowboy boots online. And I think we sold maybe 4 of them. But the CEO figured out that bank bills on time. So we did online banking software for community banks.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. I was waiting for you to say. And then before that, I wrote some programming for the BBSs where you dial in on the 1200 baud modem. And before I was on punch cards, and before that, I was using vacuum tubes.
No, I'm not that old, but I did run a BBS for quite some time, and I did play Leisure Suit Larry on an IBM XT with my dad. I don't know if that was advisable, but we played all those Sierra games where you got the little highlighter, you got the hint book, and you would highlight to find out what to do. I really like the was it King's Quest? No, maybe it was that. King's Quest was a different one, but there was one where there was a 3-part game and you were this little guy and you could be a thief or a warrior and train up. And It was good stuff.
Well, your career matches a lot of my career. Same kind of things. And it's funny, I saw an article today that when I was reading this morning on what major technologies happened on your birthdays, right? Your birthday years, right? And it started for this, and it went all the way back to, I think 1955 or something like that, which was before I was born. So that's good. And the key technology I was born in 1962 was satellites, right? So the first satellite. They had satellites that you could bounce things off of, but never an active satellite that would actually receive a signal and then transmit it in a different place.
Okay.
It's interesting to look every year at what new technology has been introduced every year, right? Like a digital computer chip showed up, I think 3 years later in 1965 or something like that. And it's And then you realize that all of us have these same career life arcs because the technology gets introduced, and then they mentioned like, okay, this introduced 4 years ago, and then by 6 years after that, it was mainstream, right? So it seemed like it took about 4 to 6 years for when they invented it and the first instance showed up to when it became mainstream and we were all doing it as a society. And yeah, the question is, if you ever had any kids, what year did the Oregon Trail show up on your computer, right? Where you're trying to make it to the West Coast without dying.
Yeah. No diphtheria. You don't want to get that or whatever it is. Dysentery. That's the one that you get.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't even know what diphtheria is. I think you get a shot for that nowadays.
Yeah. I know what dysentery is. I know that one. Don't know about diphtheria.
Yeah.
All right, so that brings us up to the show topic today, the truth about Kubernetes. And thanks for sharing. That was a good narrative and nice to know. It seems like you're a computer consultant, developer consultant, right? But you're not consulting on developer. You're consulting on how developers are supposed to develop, right? And
yeah. I mean, to be embarrassingly honest, I haven't actually written code since like 2006. So I used to be a developer, but like, kind of going back to the present, like once I became an analyst at Red Monk and went through strategy and like with the however many years I started at Pivotal in 2015. So however long that was, like what I've really grown interested in is like, particularly at large companies, like how they change a huge part of how the company does software. Right. And like the thing in my mind is always like, so like I was, you go to all the conferences as I know y'all do and other people. And and especially when it comes to software, there's always out in the world, there's always these presentations of how a tech company or a startup or some small company where you got to like, vacuum the floors at the end of the night, like where they have figured out a great way to do software and they give a presentation on it. And I always think, that's wonderful. But, if you have a company of like even 100 developers, right? That's just supporting a tech thing. Like that's a lot different than if you're like a huge bank with like 20,000 developers and you're literally like 150 years old as a company, right? And so like what I've gotten interested in is like how, when you're at that big company, how do you improve the way you do software? As the people used to say, like be like a tech company or kind of shift over to that more product way, as we would say in Tanzu land, of doing software. And what that does is like, for what I pay attention to is I pay attention to the techniques and what people do on development teams, because that's incredibly important, right? But when I talk with like the like head of transformation and VP of apps and executives, what they struggle with is like, it's hard to put it in a way that that sounds like the magnitude of the problem, but basically they're just like, people don't want to change. Right? Like that's what it often amounts to. So there's all sorts of like tactics and things and strategies people put in place to like try to change large organizations around. And that becomes like a different body of work than just what happens on a development team, which is fascinating on its own. But it's kind of like, to go back to your green beans thing, right? Like one can imagine a green bean casserole that actually is tasty and delicious. But the question is, how do you get that? Right? Like every time we try to make this good green bean casserole, it comes out really bad. Yeah,
because you don't know how to do it the first 20 times.
Right. And so you got to learn new techniques and all sorts of things to get to the ideal casserole.
Or you have to deliver your green bean casserole and be held accountable to a board, and you're working with a seriously, let's say that your tooling has been built around building that green bean casserole the exact same way for 20 some years. And
that's right.
The green bean casserole delivery network is all integrated into all of those other facets. So if you change any given one component of your toppings, your collection system, how you're cooking, even the salt that you boil the green beans in, everything else falls apart.
Oh, and what if it just goes terribly wrong? And I guess you also have these old aging recipe cards, kind of like punch cards. And what if they fall apart and no one knows how to read them anymore? And then you don't even know where to start. Next thing you know, you sign a huge outsourcing contract with like some restaurant and you're stuck doing that. Very, very frustrating.
You know what they say: no one ever gets fired for choosing a green bean casserole. Right?
That's right.
The IBM throw.
We're carrying this analogy way, way, way too
Yeah,
far.
no, it's Thanksgiving week, folks. We're recording this on Thanksgiving week, and we're publishing it. So why not? Why not? All right.
Well, Michael, it is a thing, right? I mean, we see this all the time in large financial institutions, healthcare, manufacturing, and whatnot, where we have hundreds, if not millions of, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars thrown into refactoring of these applications through major consulting firms and whatnot. And it all steps south because of the level of integration and legacy that are out there with these enterprise programs that are sometimes written in assembly or COBOL and whatnot, and it's just iterated from one version to the next just to maintain some level of compatibility. But how do you make that change? How do you step up to that next iteration and forego some of that legacy code that's out there? I'm sure it's a very difficult program.
Yeah. I think. Well, there's a couple of things. Like the first thing that I find with people when I've talked with them and I try to tell them is like the first thing to do, and this is really hard, bringing up your green bean casserole board who always wants results. They want to see, what's happening, is like, you got to start like really small and slow, kind of like a really nice smoked brisket, right? You want to do it very slowly, not, learn how to do it correctly. You're going to mess it up. And like, so that's the first thing that I see people being successful with, is the magnitude of the problem is huge, but they have to somehow think and really like prime the organization to be like, we're going to spend 6 months, maybe even 12 months, just like figuring out what we're doing. We're going to pick a few simple initial projects and kind of use them as, I don't know what the analogy, what the word is, but use them as sort of like learning apps, right? Like, because we have these new stacks of technology we're going to be using. We're following.
We're not going to change the main dish. We're going to do a little bit of a sampling course. Right?
That's right. Because everyone knows the casserole turns out according to how it was cooked. The ingredients need to be fresh, but a lot isn't how it's cooking, right? So you want to learn how to be a better, newer cook by starting with different dishes that are less. I don't know why the green bean casserole is the highest priority, but that are less stressful to mess up with, because that's what becomes good. And then as you do more and more of these projects, you move on to bigger and bigger things, right? But this also allows you, going back to actual software, this also allows you to start to understand and find kind of like those old things that need to be modernized, or you need to somehow code around defensively, right? Like there's inevitably, you're going to encounter some ERP system if you're selling something, right? And you're going to encounter like a CRM or a customer system, right? Where you need to pull customer things from. And like, you don't really want to set yourself up to like deliver changing everything in a year or maybe even 2, because you also don't really even know what you need to change, right? Like, you've just got all this stuff. And so that's a lot of like, in Tanzu land, we have this consultancy. They would never call themselves this, but it's a consultancy around like modernizing how you do operations and development. But they also have a pretty big practice on going through that analysis of just finding those initial apps to change around. And then the other thing that you do all the obvious things. That's always the answer of any airport business book about how to improve your life or your business, is just do the obvious things. But then the trickier thing that I see people doing who are successful that they skip over is, and people here will appreciate this, but like, you do a tremendous amount of like internal marketing and training, right? So one of the if you think about it, one of the main reasons people don't want to change is, one, they don't know what you're talking about, right? Like what these new things are. And then 2, like, especially in a large organization, generally doing anything different, let alone changing, is extremely risky for an individual, right? Like
the fear of loss is greater than
the
desire for gain.
Right. Like, you're there, you've been working there 1, 5, 10 years doing your green bean casserole the same way. It's always been fine. Might be a little rush, but then it's over. Everyone is, you're still employed. And someone comes to you and they're like, we're going to do something totally different. You're going to be on a different development cycle. Not only that, but you'll have the pleasure of owning and sharing more responsibility for the actual outcomes. And first of all, you're like, I don't know what an outcome is. I need to go look that up. Sharing in the actual business outcomes of this work that you're doing and have more of that responsibility. And so, as an individual, if you do that calculus in your head, it's like, so the nature of my job is changing. I'm taking on more risk, and I didn't hear anything about getting more pay. And so it's sort of like there's all sorts of management and extend this upward through the management chain and on, right? And so like there's a lot that goes into working with people to show them that things are better if they adopt a new system, that they should go through taking on this risk and go through this change. And a lot of that comes down to just like marketing. So doing more than like, we get these too because we work at a large organization, but you got to have more than the monthly email newsletter that tells you what's going on. There's a lot of hands-on kind of explaining the transformation, how things are differently, but then also going over like, look at these teams of people who changed over and now they only have to work 40 hours a week, right? Like what's the direct benefit that you have to a person? Never mind. Never mind the business outcomes, whatever those are.
It was super easy when virtualization came along, and even it was challenging, but you could actually say, see those 20 servers in the rack, you're going to be able to turn off 17 of them
totally
on your workload on the 3, and you're going to be able to go home for the weekend. And, if something goes wrong, you're going to be able to just vMotion from one to another, and your life is going to get significantly easier. I feel like Kubernetes, when I start looking at it, I go like, this is going to get significantly harder for some amount of time as we absorb, because it's one, you can't point at physical machines and go, this is what's going to happen for you. It's going to be way better. It's like, it's a learning experience to learn what the benefits of these things are going to get you when you're done with a project.
Yeah. No, I think at the Kubernetes level, that's certainly true. Right. And I think, I didn't really like live firsthand through the motion, so to speak, to like virtualization. So, it's hard for me to have like that firsthand knowledge of it. But I think what you describe is absolutely true, right? And I think, I can't make an analogy back to that, but like, so first of all, like if I'm always interested in how much Kubernetes usage there is, and having been an analyst, I'm always really careful to separate out penetration versus market share, right? Penetration being like you see this figure in surveys all the time. I think even in our surveys, we'll put this in that 80% of respondents say they're using Kubernetes. Well, you got to be really careful because that means they might just be using like one container somewhere, right? In their entire organization. So I always try to hunt down more of a market share. And at the moment, depending on what analyst you go to, I think that's around like maybe 10, maybe 15% of enterprise workloads globally like run on Kubernetes, right? And so I don't know at what point that puts Kubernetes relative to like virtualization, but I have to imagine at some point virtualization also seemed like a weird beguiling thing, right? Like it was a new skill set that you had to learn and a new everything that you have to learn, right? And I think that
it had moments like that. One of the turning points for VMware was when EMC at the time, who owned all the storage, was willing to back us up saying that we'll guarantee that, your storage will remain consistent, from moving from physical to virtual, right? And before,
totally.
Enterprise wouldn't touch it because they were worried that their data was going to get destroyed on their storage devices, right? And and then EMC bought us because they did that, and they saw the movement and the increased purchase of storage because you were no longer using storage on the computer. You had to buy mass storage units to put your VMs on. But nonetheless, it was the taking away the risk factors that helped that. But so we certainly in the P2V timeframe had to deal with that. Right.
Yeah, no, I think it's very like if this was even like 2 years ago, it would kind of be before that moment in the Kubernetes world. There would be like all sorts of talk and very, very early adopters using it. But there wasn't, for lack of a better phrase, that kind of enterprise gradeness to it, right? And especially, and storage continues to be one of the most difficult is the wrong word, but sort of like important parts is a good way of putting it, right? Because if you to the complexity of Kubernetes, right? Like one of the things that you have to get over with Kubernetes when you're kind of learning about it is there are a lot of benefits and awesomeness that people describe of Kubernetes, right? It is genuinely a very good way, a very well thought out and good way of essentially like modeling infrastructure, right? Like it's extremely stripped down. There's a very limited amount of what they would call primitives, or just the things, right? Like there's a node, a container running in a node, which you could think of as a process. Right. And then there's storage and networking. So it's that's the huge benefit of Kubernetes, is you're removing all of the variability at a certain layer of that stuff. There's just like the one.
Let me take a stab at what you're talking about. Which for me is like, infrastructure used to be like programming where everything was serial, right? You know, you had serial programming, and maybe you would call functions here or there, but mostly it was on servers and racks, and your application sat as a monolithic thing on the server and the rack, and it's very serial. And I feel like Kubernetes is bringing object-oriented kind of programming where everything was an object and you could glue your objects together, and your objects were kind of like separate. The data was an object. And I look at Kubernetes and it's like, it's treating that infrastructure like objects, where you have you have pods, and you have, elements that are part of your infrastructure now. And then you can do a lot more with object-oriented programming, as we all know, is nice because it's self-contained, and then I can move it somewhere else, or I can edit that one object, and then that object behaves. It's a way to organize things. With that object-oriented programming comes complexity. You'll see articles on the complexity of object-oriented versus serial programming, but nonetheless, it gives you a lot more power to do way more complicated things manageable. Right.
Yeah. No. I think breaking it up into, words like object or component or module or, whatever, that's exactly it, right? Is we now have this small box of a limited amount of components, which means it's a lot easier to assemble them together. Right. Right. Like, to go back in time, right? Like I'm judging from when we were all kids, there was a lot fewer Lego parts. Right. So basically, I don't know how many there were, but they were pretty basic. And nowadays, there's so many different Lego parts that you get these weird parts and you're like, I have no idea what to do with this. Right. And so it kind of adds to a mess there. Whereas more of what Kubernetes aspires to is that simplified box of Legos. Right. Now, I think to your point, I mean, this is a general like issue, is like us computer people, once we simplify something, we're like, ha, now we can complexify again. Right. Anyhow. So the first thing is to your, like, you hear all these genuinely good claims about what Kubernetes can achieve for you. But as you start kind of stripping it back, you realize that like a lot of like object-oriented programming is, and like a lot of new ways of doing cloud infrastructure. And as you were just describing with having to stick some storage into virtualization, underneath it, there's still a lot going on, right? So there's really nothing, if you were to go, so to speak, download Kubernetes and run it, like it doesn't really like manage your storage for you. That's something that you need to integrate into it. It doesn't necessarily integrate all of your networking for you. You still need to handle that, right? And there's all sorts of things to help out with that, of course. But like, that's one of the first things that at least I struggled with when I was learning about Kubernetes, is I kept trying to figure out like, all right, where's the part that actually like moves the bits around the network? And where's the part that moves the bits around in storage? And it's like so many things like this, right? Like it's not called a driver. That's a weird name for it. But, there's various components that you integrate with underneath to make sure that like it does those things for you. And so, it's good to think of Kubernetes as like a layer on top of other infrastructure, right? Like there's still that need for the infrastructure to be managed underneath it. And that's why, like, for example, right? Like a lot of the Kubernetes that we see in large organizations runs on top of the VMware stack, right? Because the VMware stack still does all of that management of infrastructure underneath it, rather than Kubernetes just being like, all the way down to the metal, right? Like, management of it.
And talking about the maturity of this, there were a lot of articles that were maybe 3 years ago when Kubernetes were just starting to be adopted in the enterprise. There were like tons of articles that were talking about the failure of projects, right? That were actually happening, and that the complexity drove the project over budget by like $5 million. There were like a lot of these kind of stories that were happening because everything was so immature that you had to kind of glue components together.
Sure. Yeah.
No vendor that was building, solid platform and solid software offerings, you had to kind of make choices. And the choices you were making were like, the startup's been there for a year and a half, right? Or they've been there. The startup is like, and they've built this piece that you could use. And then if you really knew what you were doing, you were a great open source person. You knew what to choose and you could build it and it would be successful. But many people that were trying to build these implementations would get a piece that they had selected, and it was by three guys in a garage, and it just didn't work, right, to the level it needed to. So there were a lot of those stories, but I feel like now I don't see those any longer.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely the case, and it's because what one could predict from what you're saying, that there are more mature product offerings and services from public cloud providers. So I mean, overall, Kubernetes has been around. I'll probably get this wrong, 5-6 years or so, and so like, I mean, for as big and broad a technology as Kubernetes is, right? Like, it kind of takes at least that long before you have a good general purpose chunk of infrastructure, right? I mean, you've got to, you know, just like you're saying with like EMC coming on board, right? Like all of the large enterprise vendors, not all of them, but they need to come and actually, as we are at VMware, like become a part of that community, right? And add what you have there. And I think, yeah, I mean, we would especially see this at Pivotal, because we had, I mean, essentially, like, we had what people looked as a rival to Kubernetes after a while. And so we would often encounter people who are building their own stack instead of using, it used to be called Pivotal Cloud Foundry. Now it's called the Tanzu Application Service. Yeah, that's right. And it's, you know, it's a platform as a service like Heroku and things like that.
Right.
But anyways, we would encounter people who are building their own Kubernetes stuff. And yeah, there's a lot of, it's easy to get up and running bias. I don't know if that's one of the official biases from thinking fast and thinking slow, but it's sort of like that initial thing of getting set up is easy, but then, you know, you have to like you have to manage it and upgrade it. And, you know, you would see this, I imagine this happened in virtualization as well. Back when people were trying to figure out what a type 3 versus type 2 and all those kind of different ways of doing virtual. I've never seen anyone talk about that anymore. But like, in the OpenStack world, you would see this constantly, right? Where people would get OpenStack and they would build it on their own. And this happened in the Kubernetes world a lot too, where it was really easy. Well, it was possible to get it up and running. And then as the months went by, you wouldn't upgrade it and people would leave because they knew how Kubernetes worked. And like, you ended up basically being your own software vendor for a stack. And some people do that now, but going all the way back to your point, now that there are many offerings where you don't have to build it on your own, there's a lot more success out there and a lot more hope for, you know, use.
It does bring this memory back of where, you know, there would be a project lead and they would come in, they would do it for 2 years, right? When a wave comes through, there's these guys who can swim, get on the wave, come in, and then, you know, take advantage of that wave, build something for 2 years, and then they hop off and jump back, paddle up, and you get on another wave, right? And you're left with, you know, and I'm one of these long-term guys that have been at VMware now for 15 years. Before this, I was at Sun for 15 years, where you're picking up the pieces, trying to manage what they've built from all these pieces. And when you ever have new waves, you have a set of people that are swimming out on the edge of the wave, you know, helping build these things. But because everything's not mature, then they jump off and leave, and you've got to deal with, you know, what someone created, and you're basically tearing it down and rebuilding it again as the technology matures across that wave. And so that's kind of like a pattern that I see that, you know, I think everybody goes through. Thank goodness this wave is now more mature, and, you know, you have real vendors you can build things on. And the hipsters that come through, and I'm talking my age now, right? Like the hipsters that come through, the 28-year-olds that I have to deal with putting, you know, together, you know, real solutions that last an enterprise for 15 years, you know, that has gone away to where now people are actually talking about, you know, mature products that can build implementations. But then you have this, what do I choose? How much do I invest? Decisions to make, because everything comes at a cost. So it's an interesting time. I want to stop here and just do a shout out to your blog, which is, you have a really great blog. And the reason you're on the show is because we come across blogs and we that are trending. And this one, tanzu.vmware.com, it's State of Kubernetes Survey 2021, Benefits and Challenges. So I want to do a shout out to that blog. I think you can just go Google that and find it, but it's at tanzu.vmware.com and then /content/blog/state-of-Kubernetes-survey-2021-benefits-challenges. I'll put it in the TalkShoe chat, and I'll put it on the YouTube live chat as well, if you happen to be following us. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that blog? It's a great blog, by the way, but why don't you take us through that blog for a little bit?
Yeah. So I think this is maybe the third survey we've done about the state of Kubernetes, and I've kind of hit on some of the things that I like to see in a survey like this, and to be clear, they just ask me to kind of write up findings from it. Right? There's a whole bunch of other people actually do the survey and put these things together. But I think what's interesting to look through in this is, I mean, based on what we're saying is, one, kind of like the amount of production Kubernetes that's used, right? And you see that rising. And it's also good to bring in, there's another great Kubernetes survey that the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF, does. And they have if you go look up kind of like Kubernetes running in development, testing, I forget if they have staging, but also production. It's kind of fun to look up the numbers there. But a lot of what we focus on in this survey is, of course, people who are doing on-premise versus off-premise deploys, right? And I think there's a pretty good shift in, not only, there's actually a shift down from doing on-premise deployments. It's like in this survey, it's like 55% of the respondents say that. But what that goes to is all of us are always talking about multi-cloud, managing multiple stacks of infrastructure, and multi-cloud being the case, which you see in that instance, right? So there are people running, they don't just run Kubernetes in one place. They often run it in multiple places, right? So there's that, getting to your point of building a stack and the tools around it, right? Like that's a lot of things to worry about, managing your Kubernetes instances across multiple clouds. And then to the point, as a vendor, it's easy to kind of go in, who wants to sell you something, it's easy to go into the difficulties of something, right? Instead of focusing on the positive aspects of it, right? So I think that's the part that's especially nice to see, is what the benefits people see from it, right? Because you're absolutely right. Like, there's a lot of complexity and learning to get over. But once you do get something in place, and once you've kind of figured out what to do, it does become eventually as possible as people have with virtualization nowadays, right? And so there's a good overview of benefits that people get from it, right? And there is, it may not be possible to actually point to racks, but the number one thing that people find is there's better resource utilization, right? 58% of people, I don't know. Quoting numbers in here is always a little weird. I think it's funner to go through these, but I think what really becomes important, and what I focused on a lot, is being an application developer, is that there are huge benefits to improving the applications, the old green bean casserole, if you will, right? So the goal of putting something like Kubernetes in place, for me, is not, resource utilization is great. People will talk about scaling being important. Scaling is always a cool thing to have. But really, it comes down to some of the benefits that you see, some of the top benefits, which is shortening the cycle it takes to think of something and deploying it, right? I always recommend you should be able to think of some feature you want in your software and deploy it at the end of the week, right? And that's a very real thing people see when they're architecting their applications to run on Kubernetes, and when it is running on Kubernetes, because a lot of the intention and the design and the architecture of Kubernetes is built exactly around that scenario, that we want to have our developers be able to deploy things very rapidly, And we want to automate things as much as possible to enable that. We want to standardize the configuration, the way those little simple components are done by developers and how they're done in development. So, and then equally importantly, I always try to use the word learn instead of fail, but I'll go into fail here. When your deploys fail and your applications fail out, a lot of the way that Kubernetes is designed, it makes it really easy to back out those changes, right? To revert the changes back so you don't bring down production, but also to do things like, just doing like rolling updates. So like Garmin's a customer of ours, and what they'll do with a rolling update, for example, is when they have a new change, where are they based in? I always get St. Louis and Kansas City mixed up. I think it's St. Louis, but they'll deploy it to like part of St. Louis, then all of St. Louis, then they'll deploy it to the entire state, right? And then so forth and so on to like a country. And so you can do these upgrades of a new version of a product while running the old version, which anyways, there's all sorts of things that you can do when you're running Kubernetes that really target, we're going to be deploying software every week, if not every day. And it's kind of built to doing things. So, and you see those benefits come up in the answers that people.
I'm looking at your blog, and all right, I just got to be. I'm going to do this now from every pod. I'm going to get a little Joe Rogan. I'm going to be a little sarcastic on you because I look at this. I go, the benefits section up at the top of this blog article really talks about all the great ways this is going to be good for your company and development, and your application is going to be way better, and it's going to be more responsive. It's great for the company, right? It's no question. It is absolutely this. Improves how quickly you can respond. It improves the efficiency of your development teams because you can architect with these objects and shorten software development life cycles. Containerized monolithic applications to small objects are much easier to do with. Enable you to move to the cloud. Reduce your public cloud costs. This is a great little great little bar chart, right?
Yeah, it's the floor wax.
I think of IT admins and I go, this is hell. That's hell. That's hell. This is hell. And that's hell too. Right. So I look at it as like, yep, sure. That's going to be great for the business and for developers. But I look at IT operations. Oh, look, you're going to be constantly rolling up. No, don't roll. Let's just do it all at once and then be done for like 6 months, please. Like rolling things are bad, right? Like constant every week is bad. Or like, it's like, so I look at this, I go, oh my God, this is like an IT nightmare. And my playing with Kubernetes is like, I look at it, I go, yeah, this is, I get it. It has a lot of these great benefits for the company. If you don't do this, you're going to go out of business. But talk about like, I think an extra workload for IT guys who have to keep this stuff running and build a platform. And then I think this is where VMware does come in, right? Because, if you were to talk about vMotion and how hard it would be to move stack A to stack B, back before VMware helped you do this, it would be impossible. I look at this too and I go, yeah, these are it's tricky to take the sugar candy off of this. This is building Kubernetes, infrastructure is not easy, right? But it gives you a lot of benefits. And then I go to your challenge area, the bottlenecks and challenge area of the blog, and I go, oh yeah, I recognize all of these guys, right? Lack of internal experience and expertise. Why? Because it's hard and it's going to take you like X number of years to learn this stuff. And you can't find people that are really good at it yet because we're still all trying to figure out how this happens, right? Meeting security and compliance requirements. Yeah, that's right. When you have a bunch of objects floating around with a bunch of peaches, like somebody breaks in, good luck trying to figure out where it's going wrong, right? Like what Lego piece just snapped off my pretty little Lego thing, right? So I feel like there is added complexity to, building infrastructure that sits on top, that offers up a Kubernetes platform. But I think that's where VMware comes into it because they have done an elegant job of stacking it in. And then you almost need to have people like you, Michael, to be able to come in and like help us understand how to get there. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think so.
I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. You can call me on this because
no. I think
things, and then he gets his guest to try to have to defend.
I think you point out something that I always like snidely look at in surveys, right? Which is whenever you ask someone what the challenges of a new technology are, the top three answers are generally always the same, right? The first one, depending on the age, is lack of skills and, people knowing how to do stuff, right? Which, because it's a new thing, right? And then the second thing is often security. Security is always a problem because security for a new technology is often another learning exercise of going to the security group and essentially working with them to re-understand how this new technology meets what the new what the existing security rules are, or makes it better, or whatever, right? I mean, you've got to go and reevaluate the how things fit in there. And then I don't know, the third maybe is variable. That's a good question. What the third would always be, but those top two always the same for every new technology. I'm sure when people were moving from the what is it, a vernacular, that bicycle with the giant wheel, down to the one with two wheels, it's probably lack of skills, and we're not sure if this is secure. We're probably top of the survey charts to figure out that new technology. So I think there definitely are. I mean, it definitely is that complexity. And I think, so the question to ask is like, so what's different about this that will not eliminate that complexity, but that will make it a little bit better or incrementally better this time, or at least possible, right? And I think one of the main things that's, I don't know if it's different, but one of the things that helps address it is there is a lot more understanding of helping operations people out. that's a weird way of putting it, maybe, but DevOps has come to mean a whole lot of different things in the past 10 or so years, depending on when you track the start of that. But also, if you look at kind of a more recent rev of DevOps, to be sort of like throw words around loosely, at site reliability engineering, there's a lot of thinking that went into that ops philosophy that basically is like, what if we got developers to stop writing bad code that brought down production all the time, right? And what if we kind of assumed that, like, one, the developers have a lot more, here's that word again, responsibility, right? And what that would mean is that we need to build in some functionality, some capabilities into our platform or our stack that empowers them to not keep bringing down production, right? So just as one simple example, right? Like, anytime there's a difference in configuration between development and production, something bad is going to happen, right? Like, anytime you use different tools to set up what the infrastructure looks like, different tools at all, right? Like, or even worse, like a different scheme for configuring the applications you're running, just bad things are going to happen, right? So if you look at what a lot of goes on in the Kubernetes, the actual stack itself and the ancillary projects, a lot of it is, just to choose one example here, having the same type of configuration between development and production, right? And not having it be a separate tool chain and a separate thing that you use. So there are a lot of things like that where there's kind of an appreciation, as you were just saying, right? That, like, if we're not careful, it's just going to be more junk for operations to deal with. And so let's bring in the troublemakers from the operations standpoint, the developers, and start to change how they do their software. And not only like tell them what they should be doing, but let's build the stack. Let's build Kubernetes. And you don't necessarily tell developers this so that they have less ability to screw things up, right? Like, there are more, to use a fanciful word for it, there's more guardrails, right? And you can actually do that with a lot of, not only Kubernetes itself, but more importantly, all the stuff you layer on top of it. You can really sandbox it, as a developer would say, so that it's more difficult for them to blow things up in production. But so going back to it, I think the challenge that we as an entire industry have, and especially as VMware, is exactly what you laid out there. And it's really finding the, I don't know, VI admins or like virtualization operators who are running all of this stuff and helping them just learn a new stack. And maybe not all of them like learn it, right? But identifying people and taking that kind of like slow approach that is deliberate and having, training, and is kind of a safe way to figure out how to do things. And just in the same way that they trained up to what they do nowadays, we can start to work with them to train them up doing Kubernetes things. And I think, as just one last thing, right? Like, I'm not, like I said, despite working at VMware, I'm not really like a VMware person technology stack wise, right? Like I was a Java developer and things like that. And like my observation and learning more and more about the VMware community is that like we're getting better about this in like the Kubernetes world, but we need to spend some time to kind of like demystify a lot of the talk that we do, a lot of the way that we describe things, like your object-oriented analogy, right? Like, and another thing is, and then I'll actually stop when I go over this, but this is an example I really like. If you read Kubernetes talk, right, there's a lot of talk about APIs and defining an API.
Right.
And they don't really mean what I think us older people mean when we say API, which is I'm going to call something on a remote machine or a process and hand it some data, and it's going to give me something back. Like going all the way back, it's not like, walking, an SNMP MIB or something like that. Or it's not like calling a remote procedure call over SSH or even HTTP. What they usually mean by API is what we would call like a standard, like your data standard, like what it looks like, what your configuration file looks like, that you then pass on to something else that does that for you. And so like, there's a lot of discussion to be had about like, oh, this API word means something different than calling a method, right? Like it's a different way of thinking about things. And that's why there's always this talk of configuration and things. I mean, it's kind of like there's a different mindset shift that you go through to understand like the way Kubernetes wants you to think and therefore how you work with it.
Michael, this is, in some ways, it's a fundamental shift, right, for standard VI admin. And I say that because I think about, even from the bare metal OS installs, where the traditional VI admin, yes, we knew the OS inside and out. We knew the performance tweaks. We may, through the implementer or whatnot, or through the community, as it comes to the individual application, there's some performance tweaks here and there. But once the application's set up and running, we're either handing it over to an application admin or it's just running on its own, right? And in a lot of ways, I would think that the average admin, as long as the OS is running, right, that's as much as we care. Once something at the application level breaks, we're turning it over to application support. Well, this is a paradigm shift, right? I mean, now we're more tied as admins to the application itself more than ever. And I think in some ways that's where what we talk about, and looking back on your survey, as far as roadblocks and learning curves and whatnot. This isn't that, okay, we're taking an OS from bare metal and we're moving workloads. This is now we're abstracting the OS altogether. And how have organizations really made that change, or how have you seen out in the field, or who has been empowered to make that shift of, well, now we're abstracting the OS, and now as operators, as VI admins, we need to get involved with the application and the application teams, and sometimes even down to the programming teams of how this application actually works and what the workloads are and whatnot. So how does that shift work? How are organizations making that change from these traditional admins now over to this new, fundamentally different operating model?
Yeah. I haven't thought about the multiple layers of ops in a long time. Like I remember back when I was at BMC reading through the ITEL V2 service book. I forget which one out of the 50 volume set. Not that many, but it was a very nice system. It's probably like a lot of those things where like I'd love to work at a company that sounds like that, right? Like that's when it's no one really implements it exactly as nice it is. Anyways, but I think what you're getting to is that what happens is that the need to do operations gets pushed up the stack, if that makes sense, right? So there aren't as many people needed to get to that blinking cursor of an OS install, right? Like kind of build up that level, because all of that is basically automated. Now, you still need people to like figure out automating it correctly, and if something happens to troubleshoot it, But for the most part, as you're saying, right, like you don't really like build an image anymore. You more just kind of give over to Kubernetes like, hey, when someone asks you to build, do this. And that's it, right?
You're
like
putting dial tone on the wire.
Yes. I've never really dove in and understood the dial tone analogy, but like, I think that's right, because that's what people always say. So yes, exactly. And you're automating that. So at that point, you know, so for example, this isn't from our Kubernetes usage, but with the Tanzu application server, which is, it's just a pre-Kubernetes thing. It's the same basic ideas behind it of running containers and automating it. But, you know, at a place like T-Mobile, as my European friends would make me say, T-Mobile USA, like they have just a handful of operations people who basically are helping to manage thousands of applications, right? The ratio is way, way down from what they would traditionally have. And so you free up people to focus on other things other than like that raw, that lower level of infrastructure stuff. And so those people either move on to other things, but what they do is they also go through, in the same way developers go through kind of like a rethinking of how they do things, right? To be more operations and more production oriented. And I mean, by the way, we don't talk about this very much. And I don't know if the Kubernetes people like talk about this. They're not application developers. They don't necessarily think through this, but like as an application developer, there's a whole lot of stuff you have to learn, not even about running Kubernetes, but how you architect your application, right? The way you break it up into components that can run in a highly networked, highly ephemeral, like container-based way of doing stuff. So developers have to learn a lot as well. But as you kind of free up these operation resources, what I've seen organizations do is they reform into a different way of thinking about operations, which is, we call it like a platform as a service. Some people call it platform operations. And these teams, instead of just providing that OS, that image, that blinking cursor, what they start doing is they think about themselves as building a product. That product is the platform that they're using. And they start to like literally product manage what they put into that platform. Not only like the basic Kubernetes they have, but all of the governance around it and all of the tools that are like the build tools that developers use. And they start to talk with developers about what features do you want in the product and what is the best way to implement building your software, the best way to implement monitoring that software on your own and doing basic remediation for it. And so, I mean, what you're doing is taking some of the operations people and also, just as the developers are doing, kind of setting themselves up to do a new type of management and tooling. And sure, I think there's a fair degree of people who still focus on that application troubleshooting, right? But more importantly, like working closely with developers to not only troubleshoot that initial problem, but also often maybe working with them on several releases of the product for several months, but definitely working with them as they encounter a problem and they do the long-term fix for it to think like, oh, well, here's why that happened, right? Like, here's the configuration problem that you had, and we need to bake that into your development cycle, right? And so it is like, I haven't made it sound any less daunting or challenging, but when you're kind of managing and designing the system, what you're looking for is to reduce all of that time and effort that you need to spend on just building those infrastructure components. And instead, in that same way that we're starting small and picking a few, types of casseroles to modernize, right? You take those operations people who are hopefully willing, or, you find some people who are up for this, and you add them to these new projects and this new idea of providing a platform. And just as the developers are doing, they're kind of training up to a new way of doing things and learning what fits in with them more, which, I don't know, there's plenty of developers who don't want to actually do things in a new way. And I'm sure there's operations people as well who don't want to do things in a new way. I don't know. There's lots of virtualization still left.
My summary of this, Matt, and I don't know what you feel about this, is that I feel like because cloud is becoming, ever prevalent, that your job role, and you guys both touched on this a little bit, your job role as an IT admin is shifting, right? Because we're not cabling, we're not racking, we're hardly even installing OSs now because you get cloud from the cloud providers that have the whole stack for you. I feel like we're climbing up being a little bit of the IT application person, right? So you've heard it here, which is it's almost like IT's climbing up into the application. You hear Raghu and others say it's all about the applications now, and I feel like you're an application IT specialist now. If you're going to work in IT, right, that's going to be pretty much your new role, because the underlying pieces are being delivered by large cloud providers, and what you are worried about now is how is the application performing in all of these IT components that you've put together through either cloud services or in your own data center. But it is much more focused at delivering the application, and therefore this is how the applications are being delivered, and we all need to get where we need to skills to be able to do this, right?
Yeah, and I would just add, going to the challenges, right? Like, I think there is still, I don't know if there will always be, but for a long time, there's still the need for people who like know security and networking and storage, right? Like at a pretty low level. Because like I was saying earlier, right? Like, especially when you get into multi-cloud scenarios, and like, I mean, even if you're using all just public cloud, like there's a lot of thinking that needs to go through, like, how do I do my networking, security, and storage? And that's the kind of stuff that is, I feel like people who know, who can work with Kubernetes, right? That's one set of small people, right? The lack of skills. But then people who can work with Kubernetes and also know how networking, storage, and security works are an even smaller set of people, right? And so like at anything, anything that like existing operations people who don't know Kubernetes but know those skills, like they have a lot that they can do in like the Kubernetes world. And it would be incredibly valuable for the Kubernetes community and all these developers, everyone, for them to kind of bring that knowledge over. And you don't want to skill constrain technology stack, because then it's too expensive to get all these great benefits. You got to like bring the price of having people who know what they're doing down eventually, so that you just have ubiquity and
VMware is also really good at that, right? I mean, that is what we're doing. Kubernetes and Tanzu on top of vSphere, basically gives you single panes of glass to help you manage the stuff. So we're absolutely doing a great job at making that happen, and I think that's good. Cody, we're Michael Cote, we're at the top of the hour. We try to keep at an hour. As we wrap things up, Matt, I know you have the standard questions, so I'll give you the mic, and let's wrap this guy up.
Michael, if our listeners wanted to follow you along on social media, is there a Twitter handle or a LinkedIn that you would care to share?
Sure. So my Twitter account is just Cote, COTE, and you can follow me there. I do a lot of videos and other stuff. I'm pretty good at shameless self-promotion. So that's where you'll see all the stuff that I do.
Fair enough. Thank you. Appreciate you being on, and look forward to all that more content that's coming out.
Yeah,
right.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Yeah, Michael, because we're on the community podcast, we are on youtube.com/vbarbecue. That's where people can go watch the live stream and look at us, or you can listen to us on TalkShoe. We always end up with a little bit of a barbecue report, because we are vBarbecue. So question for you, Michael. Are you going to do any kind of barbecue, anything for turkey, or what is your favorite barbecue story, restaurant? You got to take us off with a barbecue story of any kind, either Thanksgiving related or not.
Sure. Well, I live in Amsterdam. I moved here like 3 years ago, where I'd lived in Austin, Texas my whole life. And, they don't have barbecue here. I mean, by my standards, there's some places, to be fair. They
barbecue an eggplant or something really healthy. That's my match.
Yeah. I forget what the joke is, but they use barbecue as like the wrong verb or noun. Anyways, and also the meat here in Europe, I don't know what's up with the meat, but it's different. I think it's healthy. I think that's the problem. But so I was just thinking,
I think it's Chernobyl. I think all the cows glow, and it's changed the texture of the meat over there. That's
yeah. It's possible to get good meat, but you really have to find it and hunt it down. I'll tell you, I was thinking of this the other day. I'll tell you a funny barbecue thing. So being from Austin, I remember one day. Wow, must have been 10, 15 years ago. We went to a trailer my wife and I, to get some barbecue, and they had this like espresso barbecue sauce, and of course you get the brisket to test that out, right? Like that's how you're going to test things. And I think it was maybe in Yelp or something. I think I wrote like a Yelp review, and I was like, oh, this barbecue was all right, and I don't know about the espresso sauce. Like it's I don't know, I'll give it like 3 out of 5 stars. And then it turns out that trailer was like the first iteration of Franklin's Barbecue. So clearly, either they got a whole lot better, or I didn't know what I was talking about. And I think I'm the first review, maybe not for their actual location, but if you go look that up, I think I wrote the first review for that.
Your claim to fame is a mediocre barbecue report on the very first Franklin.
Yeah.
That's an awesome story. All right. That's
continuous improvement, awesome. Always in place, even for barbecue.
Yeah. It just goes to show you just always leave 5 stars. Don't ever,
that's right. That's right. Yeah, make the platform useless because everybody just does 5 stars. That's
right. Yeah, but I'm coming back in January, and I'm gonna gain some pounds by eating some proper food when I'm in Austin.
It's funny. All right, with that, everybody have a happy Thanksgiving. If you've listened to this before Thanksgiving, if not, I hope you got some good turkey in you or whatever your choice of food is. Until then, we'll be back again next week with more podcasts. Matt, happy Thanksgiving.
Same Michael, to you, and same to our listeners.